My name is Mark Rodriguez. I'm an investigative journalist with 12 years of experience covering Latin American politics and human rights cases. I've spent most of my career digging through government archives, FOIA requests, and declassified documents, trying to piece together the stories that powerful people would rather keep buried. I thought I'd seen everything: CIA coup plots, military death squads, financial corruption schemes worth millions. But 3 months ago, while researching a routine story about Pinochet's hidden bank accounts, I stumbled across something that made me question everything I thought I knew about how dictatorships really maintain power. It started with what seemed like a simple assignment. My editor at the Washington Investigative Unit wanted a follow-up piece on recently discovered financial documents from the Pinochet era. You know, the typical corruption story. Swiss bank accounts, kickbacks from arms deals, the usual dictator playbook. I'd covered similar stories before. I figured it would take me 2 weeks, maybe 3, to put together a solid piece about how Augusto Pinochet had squirreled away $27 million while his people suffered under his brutal regime. I was working my way through boxes of declassified CIA and State Department files at the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C., cross-referencing financial transactions with operational reports from DINA, Pinochet's secret police force. Standard investigative work. But then I started noticing something odd. Scattered throughout the operational reports were references to what the documents called ceremonial procedures and ritual protocols. At first, I assumed it was just bureaucratic language for standard military ceremonies or swearing-in procedures. Every military organization has its traditions, right? But something felt off about the way these terms were used. They appeared in contexts that had nothing to do with normal military protocol. And if you think you know where this is going, trust me, you don't. Because what I found buried in those classified files changed my understanding of how power really works, not just in Chile, but around the world. The financial corruption was just the surface. What lay beneath was a systematic program of psychological control that drew from some of the darkest chapters in human history. And the terrifying part is, it's still being used today. Let me start from the beginning, with that first document that made my hands literally tremble. I was about 6 hours into my research on March 15, 2025, working through a stack of DINA operational reports from 1974 to 1976. My eyes were getting tired from reading poorly photocopied documents, and I was starting to think about calling it a day when I came across a memo labeled Operational Protocol 7-7-3. The document was heavily redacted, but what wasn't blacked out made my professional instincts scream that something was very wrong. The memo described what it called enhanced psychological conditioning procedures for high-value political detainees. But it wasn't talking about interrogation techniques. The language was different, more formal, almost liturgical. It mentioned preparatory ceremonies, symbolic implements, and collective witness protocols. There were references to candle configurations and invocation sequences that had to be performed exactly as specified in what the document called the inherited procedures. I sat there staring at this memo for probably 10 minutes, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't the language you'd expect from a military intelligence operation. It sounded more like, well, like instructions for some kind of ritual. Have you ever had that feeling when you're reading something and your brain keeps telling you that what you're seeing can't be real? That was exactly what happened to me. I'm a skeptical person by nature. 12 years of investigative journalism will do that to you. But every instinct I developed over my career was telling me I'd found something significant. I decided to dig deeper. I pulled up the organizational chart for DINA and started looking for any connection to these ceremonial procedures. That's when I found a name I'd never heard before, Colonel Friedrich Weiss. He wasn't listed in any of the standard DINA command structure documents, but his name appeared in 3 separate operational memos as the protocol advisor for special psychological operations. When I searched for more information about Weiss, I found a single personnel file that had been declassified almost by accident. It was attached to a completely unrelated document about logistics. According to his file, Friedrich Weiss had been recruited to DINA in 1974, but not from the Chilean military. He'd been brought in from something called Colonia Dignidad. Now, If you know anything about Chilean history, that name should send chills down your spine. Colonia Dignidad was a secretive German settlement in southern Chile, run by a man named Paul Schaefer, who was, let's be clear about this, a Nazi fugitive. But what I didn't know until I started researching was that during the Pinochet years, Colonia Dignidad served as one of DINA's most important torture centers. Former SS and Gestapo officers who had fled to Chile after World War II were literally teaching torture techniques to Pinochet's secret police. But here's where things got interesting. I found a cross-reference in the DINA files that mentioned Weiss had been involved in what they called morale operations at Colonia Dignidad before joining DINA. When I looked up what morale operations meant in this context, I found a completely different category of documents that had been declassified but apparently overlooked by most researchers. These weren't military reports or intelligence assessments. They were what appeared to be instruction manuals, detailed step-by-step guides for conducting what the documents explicitly called fear ceremonies. I'm talking about 40-page documents with diagrams, timing instructions, and psychological analysis of how specific ritual elements could be used to break down a person's mental resistance. The documents described procedures that were designed to convince political prisoners that they were dealing with supernatural forces, not just human oppressors. Candle arrangements that created specific shadow patterns, chanting in Latin or German that prisoners wouldn't understand, mock executions performed at precise times, often at 3 in the morning when human psychological resistance is naturally lowest. The use of symbols and imagery drawn from occult traditions, not because anyone believed in magic, but because these symbols triggered deep psychological fears that could be exploited. Do you see what was happening here? This wasn't about supernatural power. It was about psychological warfare taken to its most sophisticated extreme. But the most disturbing part was a document I found titled Theoretical Foundations for Ritual Intimidation. It was a psychological analysis written by someone with clearly advanced knowledge of human behavior, explaining exactly why these ceremonial procedures were more effective than conventional torture. According to this analysis, when prisoners believed they were facing forces beyond normal human authority, something that seemed to tap into ancient, dark powers, they experienced a level of psychological breakdown that conventional interrogation simply couldn't achieve. The document explained that by conducting what appeared to be occult rituals, DINA could convince prisoners that resistance was not just futile against human oppressors, but against cosmic forces they couldn't understand or fight. It was psychological manipulation disguised as supernatural ceremony, and according to the internal assessments, it was terrifyingly effective. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever wondered why so many authoritarian regimes throughout history have used elaborate ceremonies and rituals? Why do dictators always seem to surround themselves with dramatic symbols and theatrical displays of power? I used to think it was just ego, just dictators who wanted to feel important. After reading these documents, I understand it's something much more calculated and much more sinister. The DINA files revealed that these fear ceremonies weren't random acts of cruelty. They were part of a systematic program that had been developed based on research into historical methods of psychological control. The documents reference studies of medieval torture practices, analysis of Nazi concentration camp psychological techniques, and even research into tribal initiation rites and religious ceremonies from around the world. They had literally created a science of ritual intimidation. But here's what really made my blood run cold. I found evidence that this program didn't end with Pinochet. In 2004, the same year these documents were declassified, there were reports of unusual interrogation procedures being used by security forces in several Latin American countries. Venezuela, Bolivia, and Colombia all had documented cases of political prisoners being subjected to what witnesses described as ceremonial torture. When I started researching these contemporary cases, I found disturbing parallels. Political prisoners in Venezuela reported being subjected to mock trials that resembled religious ceremonies, complete with candles, chanting, and symbols painted on walls. In Bolivia, opposition leaders described being held in rooms decorated with occult symbols, while their captors performed elaborate rituals designed to convince them they were dealing with forces beyond normal political authority. And here's the really unsettling part. When I cross-referenced the timing of these incidents, they all occurred within months of each other in late 2023. Almost like someone was coordinating the use of these techniques across multiple countries. I reached out to contacts in human rights organizations who work in Latin America, asking if they'd noticed any patterns in how political prisoners were being treated. What I learned was that there had been a significant shift in interrogation and intimidation techniques starting around 2022. Multiple countries began reporting cases where political prisoners described experiences that sounded less like conventional torture and more like elaborate psychological theater designed to convince them they were facing supernatural forces. Think about some of the political crackdowns you've seen in the news over the past couple of years. The way opposition leaders have been not just arrested, but seemingly broken in ways that go beyond what you'd expect from normal imprisonment. The strange, ritualistic nature of some of the public confessions and recantations we've seen. When you look at it through the lens of what I found in these DINA documents, it starts to make a terrifying kind of sense. But let me tell you about the specific document that convinced me this wasn't just historical curiosity. In the DINA files, I found a training manual dated October 1975 titled Advanced Psychological Operations, Ceremonial Implementation. This wasn't just theory. It was a practical guide for conducting what they called fear ceremonies, complete with equipment lists, timing schedules, and psychological assessment criteria for determining which prisoners would be most susceptible to ritual intimidation. The manual described exactly how to set up what they called transformation chambers, rooms designed to look like occult ceremony spaces with specific lighting, symbol placement, and acoustic properties that would maximize psychological impact. It explained how to recruit and train personnel to act as ritual facilitators, essentially actors who could convincingly perform elaborate ceremonies designed to convince prisoners they were dealing with supernatural forces. Most chilling of all, the manual included effectiveness assessments. They had actually measured and documented how much more successful their interrogations became when they incorporated these ceremonial elements. According to their own internal data, prisoners subjected to ritual intimidation provided information 43% faster than those subjected to conventional interrogation methods and showed significantly higher rates of long-term psychological compliance. They had turned psychological manipulation into a precise science, disguised as occult ceremony. When I think back to news stories from the past 2 years about political prisoners who seemed to undergo dramatic personality changes in custody, or opposition leaders who emerged from prison seeming almost hypnotically compliant, does the timing seem strange now? Because I started noticing patterns that I'd never seen before. I found myself going back through news reports from Venezuela, looking at footage of political prisoners making public confessions. There was something about the way these confessions were staged, the specific lighting, the formal, almost ceremonial setting, the way the prisoners seemed not just defeated, but somehow fundamentally altered. When I compared these to the procedural guidelines I had found in the DINA documents, the similarities were unmistakable. The same thing with some of the footage that leaked from Myanmar after the military coup in 2021. Video of opposition leaders being held in rooms that seemed designed more for ceremony than detention. Candles, symbols painted on walls, arrangements that seemed to follow specific patterns. At the time, Western media reported these as examples of the military's brutality or psychological torture, but they missed the sophisticated system behind it. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were the implementation of a precisely designed program of psychological control that traced directly back to the research and development work done by DINA in the 1970s. I want you to think about something. When you see footage of authoritarian regimes conducting what appear to be elaborate ceremonies, whether it's public trials with unusual staging, confession videos with specific symbolic elements, or political prisoners appearing at events that seem more theatrical than legal, what are you actually looking at? Most people assume it's just dictators being dramatic. But what if it's something much more calculated? What if these apparent ceremonies are actually the implementation of psychological warfare techniques that were refined and perfected 50 years ago by some of the most brutal intelligence operatives in modern history? The more I researched, the more I realized that what I discovered wasn't just historical information about the Pinochet regime. It was evidence of an ongoing system of psychological control that has been adapted and refined over decades, passed down through networks of intelligence operatives and military advisors who move between authoritarian governments around the world. I found financial records showing payments from the Chilean government to psychological consultants, who later appeared on the payrolls of security services in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Myanmar. I found evidence of training programs where techniques developed by DINA were taught to intelligence operatives from other countries. And I found contemporary reports describing interrogation and intimidation procedures that followed the exact same patterns outlined in those 1970s DINA training manuals. The ritual elements weren't about supernatural beliefs. They were about exploiting deep-seated human psychological vulnerabilities that cross all cultural boundaries. Fear of the unknown, fear of forces beyond human control, fear of cosmic punishment. These are universal human anxieties that can be triggered and manipulated through carefully designed ceremonial procedures. And the most disturbing realization was that this system has become more sophisticated over time, not less. The original DINA procedures were crude compared to what I found evidence of in contemporary operations. Modern authoritarian regimes have access to decades of psychological research, advanced understanding of human neurology, and communication technologies that allow them to amplify the psychological impact of these ritual intimidation techniques. When I looked at the broader pattern, I realized I wasn't just looking at isolated historical documents. I was looking at evidence of a systematic approach to psychological control that has been continuously developed and refined for 50 years and is currently being implemented by authoritarian governments around the world. Think about it this way. We know that authoritarian regimes share intelligence, coordinate operations, and exchange personnel. Why wouldn't they also share and refine techniques for psychological control? The evidence suggests that what DINA developed in the 1970s has become a kind of dark curriculum that gets passed between intelligence services, adapted to local conditions, but maintaining its core psychological principles. Have you noticed how political opposition in authoritarian countries seems to collapse more completely now than it did in previous decades? How opposition leaders don't just get arrested or exiled, but seem to undergo fundamental psychological changes that leave them unable to effectively resist. That's not an accident. That's the result of 5 decades of refinement in techniques of ritual psychological control. What I found in those declassified documents wasn't just historical evidence of past atrocities. It was a blueprint for ongoing operations that are happening right now, all around the world, designed to convince people that they're facing forces beyond human resistance. The question I keep asking myself is, if these techniques are this effective, and if authoritarian regimes are still using them, how do we even begin to resist them? How do you fight back against psychological warfare that's designed to convince you that resistance itself is impossible? And here's what really keeps me up at night. The documents I found represent just a tiny fraction of what DINA actually developed. Most of their psychological research files remain classified, even 50 years later. Which means what I discovered, disturbing as it was, is probably just the beginning. So I'm sharing this here anonymously, because I think people need to understand what they're actually looking at when they see footage of political prisoners making ritualistic confessions or opposition leaders who seem fundamentally changed after being in government custody. You're not looking at simple brutality. You're looking at the implementation of systematic psychological control techniques that were developed by some of the most sophisticated intelligence operatives in modern history. What do you think about this discovery? Have you ever noticed anything strange about the way political opposition seems to collapse in certain countries? Does this change how you view some of the confession videos and public recantations we've seen from political prisoners over the past few years? Because once you understand what you're looking at, you can't unsee it. And once you realize that these techniques are still being used, still being refined, still being shared between authoritarian regimes around the world, it becomes impossible to view international politics the same way ever again.